Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock.
Welcome, the Christians that meet in High Desert and also in CCC. I'm very pleased to bring this presentation to you of the evidences of how we know about God. This segment, we're going to be talking about how we know that God even exists. We're very much looking forward to bringing this segment to you and other segments about how we know the Bible's true, what the message of salvation is. So sit back and enjoy. We also invite you to come to the chapel. You might have some questions after this video. You might want to ask us some questions. We welcome that. Won't you come and be with us and learn more about salvation in Jesus Christ?
Is there a God? This is the most important question a person can ask themselves. The reason being that the conclusion we arrive at will dictate our conduct and our values. It will affect our worldview and our purposes for life. It will affect the interaction of every individual we encounter for the rest of our life. The direction of this lesson is to answer any questions you may have to that very important, all-important question: does God exist?
How do we arrive at an answer as to whether or not there is a God? Everyone falls actually into four possible areas of belief. And make no mistake, these are beliefs that we have. Some people are atheists. That means that they do not believe in the existence of God. They're usually very outspoken about their personal beliefs that there is no God. Some people are agnostic, which really means that they haven't decided. They would say sometimes that I just don't know, but usually they're not very interested in knowing whether or not there's a God. They are kind of unconcerned, apathetic towards the question. Then some people are deists. A deist believes that there is a higher power, but their concepts about that is essentially that higher power put this world and everything into existence, gave the world a spin, and now we're kind of on our own. And then finally, there are those whose belief system we would describe as theists. They believe in the existence of God. They believe that God is active in our lives, in this world, and they would try to convince others of the same. So everyone falls into one of these four categories. The question is, where are you in your system of belief?
How do people arrive at their answer? Here are some ways that we've identified. Culture. If you're born Islamic, it's likely that you're going to grow up with an Islamic belief. History of people and religion. This is commonly seen in our culture. This religion was good enough for mom and dad and grandma and grandpa, so it's good enough for me. Conversion. Are we converted, and what is the reason for a conversion from where we were to where we're at? Scientific theory. We weigh the evidence and we form an opinion and make a decision based on things that we can touch and see. But are any of these valid criteria to determine your faith upon? That's the question that we have for us now.
Yeah, what Rick brings up is exactly right. Let's take culture, for example. If it's just culture that should determine our beliefs, I don't know if that's going to work so well. Think about it this way. What if we're Aztecs? Should we just follow with our culture and continue to stab into the chest of a living person and rip out a heart still beating? Does that seem like good religion and what we should be like as religious people before God? Or let's say we were raised in the culture of Nazi Germany. Should we still have within our hearts and our minds this idea of exterminating a whole race of people just because they're a different background and history, but actually they look just like us and share the same blood? Maybe culture isn't the way to go. Just to show you a real ridiculous point of culture. In World War II, there was a lot of very primitive cultures that still even exist today in a lot of the Polynesian and Micronesian islands in the Pacific that didn't have a lot of contact with any of the technological advances that the rest of the world experienced. Well, they did get that contact in World War II. All these people were fighting over these different islands for air bases, and the next thing you know, people would show up with amazing things they'd never seen before, like vehicles, certain kinds of medicines, planes, and just amazing things, all kinds of food, and just it seemed like an unending supply. Well, pretty soon another group would come in and replace the other group in a battle or a war, and they would do the same thing. They would bring in all these supplies and new things and things that they couldn't even have dreamed of before. But guess what happened after the war? They quit coming. And they went right back to their primitive cultures, but they wanted all these new things and these great things that they had before. How would they get them? They actually developed a religion. They developed rituals where they would build airstrips and come up with fake-looking radios and things like this to try to get the people to come back and give them all these things that they enjoyed before. That's what their culture told them, and it's called the cargo cult. Some of them still even exist today, but I don't think it should be just culture that determines our belief.
As we think about the personal traditions and influences of our family, we need to ask ourselves again, is that really a valid criteria? In some ways, the example that I think of is growing up here in the Honey Lake Valley. There was this idea that I had heard for years and years that somehow there was an underground connection between Eagle Lake and Honey Lake, and actually even Pyramid Lake over in Nevada. But the thing is, Eagle Lake is 5,100 feet elevation. Honey Lake is 4,200 feet elevation. So that just wouldn't work because Eagle Lake would drain completely into Honey Lake. But that was a tradition that was here in the valley, and it was repeated so many times. So the idea that this religion, whatever the belief was, is good enough for my grandfather, it was good enough for my father, it's good enough for me, is really not significantly different than someone saying, well, my family's always believed in the tooth fairy, so I do too.
I think you make a great point, Bret. And also in the example of conversion, one of the most common examples of conversion that we witness in our culture is someone who was raised as a Christian, and when they go to a university, they're persuaded to become an atheist. But why is that? Now, the professors can give a very convincing argument, but do they tell the whole story? Is their argument valid also? That's a question we need to seriously consider.
We live in a technological society, and many of us pride ourselves upon knowing many scientific facts and scientific truths. And so some of us have trusted our belief system to scientists. But my question is, now wait a second. You sure that you want to trust everything to what our scientists are saying? Because many times they're wrong. You might remember one account in 1999 when NASA sent a Mars rover to explore Mars, but it didn't work out that way. In fact, I have some notes here about what happened. One team used English units, inches, feet, and pounds, while they were creating this module. The other team used metric units for key spacecraft operation. Well, it didn't work too well, because when it finally ended up near Mars, here's what happened. The craft was supposed to draw within 60 kilometers of Mars instead of the expected 150 kilometers, and therefore it ruined the mission. No big deal. It was only $94 million. I don't know if I want to trust my soul to humans that are just as fallible as me.
In fact, there's a big difference that we should note between scientific theory and scientific fact. And sometimes it's even what we think is fact. There was a professor at the University of Alabama that was the history professor there, in charge of the history department, by the name of Ed Harrell. And he used to teach a history class where they made reference to the half-life of knowledge. And essentially what that was the amount of time before half of what man thought he knew was wrong. And so, again, do we really want to depend on scientific concepts by fallible man for the reason behind our beliefs?
So what you're saying is even what we know now, and all of us are very firm about, that as time goes on, we have not perfected our understanding of this world nor its mechanics, and that we're going to start learning things that in hindsight we're going to think ourselves foolish for having believed these things. Kind of like the idea of one time everybody believed that the earth was flat, or in order to get rain all you had to do was dance around a campfire in a certain way or something like that, right?
Exactly.
I see. Maybe this isn't the most valid way to come to your belief. We're going to suggest to you a new way, a way of God. In fact, when I've been looking at different things of God, here's what I want to suggest to you. If there is a God, there would be evidence of Him. And if there is no God, there would be evidence of that too. But we're not asking for you to have blind faith. What's that passage in Hebrews that says?
Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
God Himself is not asking for us to have blind faith, but to follow the trail of evidence. He is putting evidence there for us. If I go to a beach, and I see some footprints on the beach, I would recognize right away that there was somebody there at one time. I can't see that person. I don't know them. But I see the evidence that they left behind. What we're going to suggest to you is that there's 2 points that God has showed us to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that He exists and that we have no excuse to not believe in Him. What are those 2 points that we're talking about?
Romans 1:18-20 presents the 2 points that we want to discuss. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse.
So in essence, we're going to talk about these 2 facets. When you look at the design of the creation itself and how perfectly it is set up for life, we kind of come to the conclusion that there must be a God. The other thing that we look at is the moral consciousness of man. The spirit of man reflects something unusual about him.
Yeah, Brett, that last point that you brought up, the moral law, let's deal with that next. Because, as you know, every age and every culture and every race of people have had a moral law. Animals do not have this moral law. They live by instinct, and they don't sit around and think about what's best for their society or what's best of how to treat somebody else. And that's why you don't have sociologists for tigers. You have sociologists for people. And one of the things that they find as they go and look at these different cultures is that many of them have very similar moral laws or what they value as a society. There might be a few little differences there, but it's nothing really big and makes them just so much different than even our society today. Think of a society where people were admired for running away in battle. There isn't any. Think of a society where somebody was admired for double-crossing those that had treated them the best and were closest to them. There isn't any. And that's what we're talking about with even things like murder and adultery and how marriage should work and raising your children. These are all very similar to all the cultures throughout all times. What are some other things that we might be looking at that are kind of the same as we talk about this moral law?
Well, one of the things that I see is loyalty, because we see in every age, whether it was to a nation or a tribe or a family or something that we've experienced at the prison, is even to the gangs. Loyalty is admired and disloyalty is despised. You can't get around the idea that everybody, I don't care who you are, believes in right and wrong. So there's no escaping that moral consciousness that people have.
And we must ask ourselves this question: where did it come from? Because the minute we ask ourselves that question, we recognize that something is greater outside of ourselves. It's greater than just one person. Well, that kind of does away with the whole concept of atheism, that only within a person themselves are they the highest order of all things. Have you guys ever seen that movie Schindler's List?
Yep.
How many times did you see it?
Just once.
How many times?
Just once.
Same with me. I don't want to ever see it again. It's a horrible movie to watch, but it's a needful movie to watch. And it's because of the moral message that it's saying. Anybody watching Schindler's List cannot just turn around and say, no, there's no such thing as a moral law for everyone. In every time and in every place and in every age, what the Nazis did is wrong. And there's no way we can ever come back and say it's right. But sometimes this is in huge contrast to what people are trying to tell us. Because we do have moral standards, but animals do not. And Bret and I were just talking about how that sometimes when we see animals act a certain way, we want to put a moral value on it. But there is no morality with animals, right? What's one example we were talking about earlier?
Well, one of the things that I always think of is that with bears or tigers, they will kill and eat their young. They kill and eat the sick, the weak, the old. And they don't sit and ponder whether it was morally right or not. And really, people don't ponder whether a tiger killing and eating is morally right or not either. So they don't have that consciousness. And like you said, the question is not whether there is a moral consciousness or a moral law. The question is, if all the rest of the creation does not have it, but man does, again, where did it come from?
So it's a little bit different than maybe what Disney has showed us. Rick, I know you used to work for CDF and be out in the forest a lot. Do you think that maybe we should start getting some of these rangers out there arresting some of these male adult grizzlies and bringing them to trial for some of the murders of eating all those cubs and things like that?
Interesting concept, Dane.
Well, it is a state job, I guess we can have that. But here's what we're saying is Disney has showed you a certain thing about that animals should act like us and talk like us and think like us, and that's not true at all. What we know is this, is that humans are different than anything else in creation. And there's no reason why we should be arresting male grizzlies for eating their young. Why do we get so upset about things like that? Our moral view. That's why we get upset when even something that doesn't have morality does something outside of our standards of morality. Where do we get this moral view? That's the question we're trying to deal with here today. Because here's what we're trying to say is that moral value is the same and universal no matter where you go. It's kind of like 2 + 2 is 4 wherever you go and in every age. In the Renaissance, it was true. In medieval times, it was true. With the Croatians, it was true. In North and South America, it was true. What we're suggesting is the same as with moral law. Because moral law came from one source. That is God. Moral law did not come from all of us. We didn't sit around and think about it. There might be a few variations in things like this. Somebody says, what's selfishness? Some might say, well, selfishness is when I keep something back just for myself. Or somebody says, well, what about if you just keep something back for your society, for your family? Or what about for my village? Or for my nation? See, this is something that we struggle with even today because we have immigration that comes in and people saying we should not share with them and there should be boundaries of what we should share and what we should do. There's some variations in that, but everybody would finally agree upon certain things about selfishness and how it's not a good thing and that sharing is a good thing. It's showing us that there's something universal going on in the spirit of man, and that's what God was talking about in Romans. One of the evidences that we have to know that there is a God is that there's a spirit in us that makes us different than all the rest of creation. This evidence of the spirit is this moral law that we carry. Look, you know as well as I, if you're driving down the road and you run over a chicken, oh well, he's gone. You keep going. But if you run over a child, a human child, there's a great difference in that. Now I hope you can see this point. Otherwise I'm never giving you the keys to my car. There is a difference and a major point. And it's because there is something inside of us that's different than all creation. And God called it His image.
One of the things that people might argue is that we don't all see those values as the same. But even that suggests a moral consciousness. When you think about loyalty, everybody has loyalty and everybody values it. Sometimes it's loyalty only to oneself. Sometimes the loyalty is expanded to include one's family, or perhaps one's gang, or one's village, or one's nation. But everybody values loyalty at some level. You can't escape the fact that that is put up as a higher standard. And one of the interesting things about that is, with a tiger or a bear, his nature predicts his behavior, it defines his behavior, it defines him. But mankind and cultures throughout the world, they are saying, here is the standard that we are trying to rise to, something higher than our natural inclinations in loyalty or being not selfish or other-oriented or sharing. There is some area that we extend ourselves to a higher standard. It doesn't exist anywhere else in creation. Why does it exist in man? It has to be God.
And some have actually even argued that because there is a standard so high that nobody keeps it perfectly, that it is something higher than ourselves. Because no tiger sits around and says, oh, I'm not fulfilling all that I can be as a tiger. He is content with who he is as a tiger. But mankind struggles with this idea of reaching the full potential, and yet nobody feels that they've reached it, but they keep striving for it. I think that's another point that shows us this is something that is outside of us, and it's got to be the work of God inside of us.
True science, or scientific fact, never contradicts the existence of God. In fact, it is antagonism toward the existence of God by individuals, scientists. It's the result of personal bias and belief in that which is unproven theory. Nobel Prize winner Dr. D.M.S. Watson admitted this to be true as he spoke of the theory of evolution. And he said, and I quote, "A theory universally accepted not because it can be proved by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible." And this is clearly a bias of the doctor.
So what we're talking about in this second point that Romans discusses is that there's so much order in creation that it is an evidence that there is a superior being, a superior engineer, a superior designer who put all of this together. Because we don't have a situation like you and I, if we're trying to build something, we have to keep going back to the hardware store to get something we forgot. It wasn't like creation is here, then somebody says, oh, we forgot water. Everything was here and designed and perfect in that. There's actually a paper that was presented by Brandon Carner of Cambridge in 1973 at the 500th year celebration of Copernicus and his discoveries about the solar system. And what he did is he came up with this idea, he called it an anthropic principle. And what it means is this, is that there seems to be a lot of values within physics and chemistry to support life and life on this planet. For example, gravity is roughly 1,023 times weaker than electromagnetism. If gravity had been 1,033 times weaker, stars would be 1 billion times less massive, very small, and they would burn 1 million times faster, which would mess up life in this solar system. Also, the nuclear weak force is 1,028 times the strength of gravity. Had the weak force been slightly weaker, all the hydrogen in the universe would have been turned to helium, making water impossible, for example. A stronger nuclear strong force by as little as 2% would have prevented the formation of protons, yielding a universe without atoms. People, that's a bad thing. We need atoms. Decreasing it by 5% would have given us a universe without stars. These are some of the things that Brandon Carter, a physicist, brought up of how he seems interesting that all these values sustain life on this planet.
Now, one of the things that, because that's quite complicated when you think about all that, and it's sometimes too much for me, but one of the things that makes this real simple is, for me anyways, is to understand the significance of the hydrogen atom. It is a fact and a unique property of the hydrogen atom that it is lighter by volume as a solid than it is as a liquid. And basically that means ice floats. If that were not the case, the oceans would freeze from the bottom up and the seas of our world would be lifeless. And that's what we're talking about, the perfection of the universe for life. And the question that just needs to be asked is, does this seem arbitrary chance or the result of intelligent design? Now, one of the other areas that we are trying to share with you is the unique field of molecular biochemistry. It's a field that's new to the 20th century since the development of the electron microscope. And what it comes down to is this. Prior to that development, evolutionary theory had long based its arguments on anatomical structure of various species. In other words, lower life species have a rudimentary eye. And so it was assumed that that rudimentary eye would have developed through slight changes over long periods of time and become the kind of eyes that we have in more complex species like man or eagles or something of that nature. With the invention of the electron microscope and molecular biochemistry, they have come to understand that it's not the anatomical structure that matters, but what they are seeing is a mechanical function, a chemical mechanical function that takes place at the cellular level, and it leaves us with what we sometimes call irreducible complexity. That is a big word, but it has kind of a simple meaning. It simply is the idea that any system can only be reduced to a minimum number of parts before it ceases to function. And what we're finding out is that our whole body functions on the basis of this chemical, mechanical, irreducible complexity. And it kind of helps to understand that if you have someone who is mechanically inclined and understands how those things work, because I don't, but Rick is a mechanic.
That principle is very clearly seen in an automotive engine. An engine must have a crankshaft, connecting rods, piston, must have spark, it must have fuel delivery to function. There are some parts of an engine that can be removed and it would still work as it was intended, such as an exhaust manifold. The engine will still run. But if you take away the fuel system, the carburetor, for example, of an older design engine, the engine will not work. And the carburetor itself is a fairly complex system, and if you remove a float out of the carburetor, it's not going to function either. So there is a limit to the simplicity of any system, and there comes a point when that system simply will not work.
What about the stereo, Rick? Do you need the stereo for the engine and the car to work?
If I'm riding with you, Dane, it's absolutely necessary.
So what we're talking about here is the minimum number of things that must be there, present, and working all at the same time. And so evolution suggests that the changes that took place in the various creatures happened over a long period of time, and one part would develop, and then another part would develop, and then another, and they would all be working just gradually. But what we have found within this field is that all of the parts have to be there and functioning in exactly the right sequence all at the same time, or it doesn't work. And that's what you're saying about the engine, right?
Correct. The carburetor was not invented 100 years before the internal combustion engine. It was developed after the internal combustion engine was designed.
Yeah, I can see someone like Aristotle saying, look what I've made. I've made a carburetor. Well, what's it do? I don't know. It's for something in the future. That's kind of what evolutionists are trying to get us to believe, is that these parts evolve independently, even independently of use with one another.
Exactly. So, to go back to the illustration of the eye, when light strikes the retina of our eye, a complex mechanical system begins to function at the cellular level. And there are 8 chemical parts, if you will, that must react and interact with each other, and they must do so precisely and sequentially, or we don't see. So there's no way for that to have developed one part at a time over a long period of time. All 8 parts had to be there, fully functional, and in the right order for our sight to exist as it does. If we cut ourselves, there is a complex mechanical system that begins to function. And in medical fields, they refer to this as the blood coagulation cascade. And it is 17 exactly precise, sequential, mechanical occurrences that take place at a cellular level that prevent us from bleeding to death. And in like manner, there are 6 more cellular reactions that have to occur precisely and sequentially to prevent all the blood in our body from coagulating or clotting and killing us. So again, the question is, does this precision of a complex mechanical system, all together, working precisely, working sequentially, does that suggest arbitrary chance, or does it suggest intelligent design? And clearly, it is the latter.
I think that's what it's saying in the book of Romans when he was saying that these are one of the evidences of God, so that anyone who does not believe in God is without excuse.
Right.
Because of the Spirit that dwells within us and because of the order of creation around us, there definitely is evidence. Just like seeing the footprints on that beach, and I say, hey, there is evidence that somebody was on this beach before me. There is the footprint, so to speak, of God in our world to know that He exists.
Amen.
That's right.
As with the theory of evolution, it's really not possible to prove or disprove the existence of God through any repeatable scientific medium. What we do, though, is just what God said in Hebrews 11:1. We look at the evidences, for and against, and we make a determination as to what the evidence suggests. Clearly, the evidence logically portrays an intentional design and an infinite wisdom in our universe at both large levels like stars and small levels like cells. It's no wonder that Albert Einstein said, "My religion consists of a humble admiration of the illimitable superior spirit who reveals himself in the slightest details we are able to perceive with our frail and feeble minds."
Well, that's easy for you to say. Let's sum up now. Review everything that we've learned today. Here it is. There's 4 different kinds of belief. You're either an atheist, an agnostic, a deist, or a theist. And why did you come to those different ideas and different beliefs? Well, we talked about it might be because of your culture, that your family has been this way, so you've always been that way. We might also be it's just because of the history of people. Well, if it was good enough for grandma, it's good enough for me. And we also talked about people being converted from one of these beliefs to another. And then we also talked about some people trying to have a secular viewpoint and think that their beliefs are confirmed by science. What we're suggesting to you is that none of these are a good criteria for understanding whether there is a God or not. Well, how does God reveal Himself? Well, we looked at Romans 1. Here's what he says. There's 2 reasons why everyone should know that I exist. The first one is the spirit of a person inside of them is different than a raccoon, is different than a mole, and is different than a badger, is different than a rock, it's different than a tree. But there's a value to it. And we also see this spirit manifested in that all societies have this moral law. None keep it perfect, but yet people strive for it and recognize the value of it. Tigers don't sit around and contemplate things like this. The second one is just the order of creation. So that God says, you can look around and see that this is designed. Hey, guess what? The pine tree works with water and with sunlight. There is a complete system design. Like Rick, if I tell him, hey, come over and fix my car, he understands what cars work. He understands there's a system to it. He can start working on the carburetor or the exhaust system. He's able to troubleshoot because there is a design and a plan in the system, and he can comprehend it. And we can see that design in creation around us. So what that tells me right away then is it eliminates 2 of these, an atheist and an agnostic. An atheist doesn't believe there is a God, but usually most atheists I find are just mad at God, even though they don't believe in Him. Okay, you work the math on that. The second one is an agnostic who says, I don't really know, and I don't really care most of the time. But now, with these 2 points that there is a soul in people, and watching Schindler's List, every agnostic would say, yes, it is wrong for the Nazi movement to do what they did. We just got rid of this whole idea that there is nothing higher than us. So we just eliminated the atheist and the agnostic. And what we're going to be dealing with the next series is, how do we know which God to believe? Is it the deist, the theist? Is God still interactive in our lives? Does He care about us? What is He doing for us? These are the issues that we want to deal with in the coming series. But understand this first of all, everyone is without excuse if they don't believe in God. I think we presented some really good evidence that God does exist.
Amen.
And I think you believe it too, because I think you're going to feel something different in your heart if you run over a chicken or if you run over a little boy. And that's the greatest evidence of all right there. We hope to see you in our chapel times, and also we're looking forward to some more of these series to answer some of these questions and also some of the things you might hear on the yard. We are definitely looking at the evidences of God and the evidences of why you should believe, with this in mind, that you're going to come to this conclusion: there is a God. Now I need to spend some time and some effort to seek Him, to know His will, and to know His way, because it is the best. He is the way and the truth and the life. And we're looking forward to presenting more of Him to you through His Son, Jesus Christ. Thanks for your time. We'll see you next time.
Elijah Rock, shout, shout.
Elijah Rock.
Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout.
Elijah Rock.
Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout.
Elijah Rock.
Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout.
Elijah Rock.
Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout. Elijah Rock, coming up, Lord.